Good evening, viewers, and welcome back to Candid Talk. This evening's program is entitled The Counsel of Friends. Now, as you know, the ongoing global pandemic has raised some fundamental questions about the very ethos of political leadership, as well as the efficacy of politics and policies that are implemented in nations all over the world in order to arrest its growth. Now, in this particular episode, I've invited a panel of very eminent friends to share their views on the critical questions of our time and also perhaps to engage in a healthy debate. We have Dr. G.D. Gautama, originally a PhD in physics from IIT Delhi, but thereafter a career civil servant, who was the former Home Secretary and thereafter the former Chief Information Commissioner, the government of West Bengal. Dr. Bhramar Mukherjee, who is the John D. Kalbfleisch Collegiate Professor and Chair of Department of Biostats and a Professor of Global Health and Epidemiology at the University of Michigan. And last but not the least, my dear friend, Dr. Siddartha Bandopadhyay, whom we used to call Bando from our press days, who is a Professor of Economics at University of Birmingham and Director for the Multidisciplinary Center for Crime, Justice and Policing. His work cuts across economics, law, medicine, psychology, and political science. A very warm welcome to all of you. Dr. Gautama, we'll start with you first, if we may, and we'll talk about lockdowns. Okay, so the first theme of our program is lockdowns, the need for lockdowns, the ethos, the timing, and the efficacy. Obviously, we don't want to politicize this debate in the spirit of the candid talks that we hold here at Prohor. But tell me, in terms of a career bureaucrat, a civil servant, someone who's been at the forefront of implementing and executing policies for decades, have we been doing a good job of arresting the pandemic overall?
This is a very unprecedented situation in the government side. We do come across a variety of activities when we are tested to the hilt. It could be floods, it could be, for example, the earthquake, so on and so forth. But this kind of a situation is unprecedented, not only for India, but for the world as a whole. Having said that, I would like to mention that the government have tried what best they could. And apparently, there are gaps, and they have been emerging from time to time. These gaps are being plugged as to the extent possible. But having said that, I would also like to add that the government can do whatever it can do as it is facing the situation, which I said is unprecedented in nature. In the meantime, there is a very big and important responsibility on the part of the citizens as well. Because you see the issues of wearing masks, issues of social distancing, so on and so forth. You do have laws, you do have regulations, but they are as good or as bad as they are implemented on the ground. And that is where we have a collective responsibility as citizens to come across and help the government. And herein, of course, it's also a process of hit and trial. And there have been situations when from time to time the government have reviewed their own decisions. And of course, they have been debated whether they are right, they are wrong, to what extent the lockdown should be done, to what extent it should be done, which are the areas which should be covered. And as we will go down the line in this debate, most of the issues will come particularly relating to the economy and loss of jobs. To cut it short, I would like to mention the government has done what best it could be done, but apparently there have been some gaps which have been debated from time to time. And as I did mention in the beginning, it is an unprecedented situation.
So, Dr. Gautama, the moot question, at least during the early part of the pandemic, when it hit India, was, is a full lockdown even necessary? Now, what is your personal considered view on this? Was it necessary? We'll talk about the efficacy of it. We'll talk about whether it's bought us enough time and what we've done with that time. But was it necessary when it happened in the last week of March?
I think it was necessary because, as you would have seen, the experiences of the other places where it has come earlier. It is absolutely necessary. Full lockdown was, according to me, complete necessary, because the kind of the disease it is the full lockdown is something, which is completely warranted.
Mhm. So, in terms of the way that it was implemented, right, with a minimum, I would say not even a full day, but like 4 hours of preparation, right? And then it's like completely shutters down. So, tell us about the mode of implementation and what it would have meant for government officials and functionaries on the ground to implement that, the challenges that they would have faced.
Yes, as you have mentioned, if some time was given, it would have been better. It would have been better because the level of preparedness with the officials was not there. Because it is, as I repeat, it is an unprecedented situation, and more time perhaps would have given them a better level of preparedness. But there's no point in going into that right now, because whatever has to happen has already happened. But it is absolutely necessary, it was necessary, that perhaps if some more time was given, the level of preparedness would have been better, and thereby the implementation would have been better.
Mhm. Absolutely. Dr. Gautama, thanks for your views. We'll be coming back to you for many other questions. Bhramar, we'll come to you next. So tell us a little bit about the epidemiological models that you've run and the projections that you had.
So thank you, Avik, for bringing us together. It's really the Council of Friends and Council of Science is extremely important in fighting this pandemic. So my involvement with the modeling was rather coincidental. And it was the first day of the shutdown in Michigan, where many of us who were worried about India and our loved ones in India started reading and thinking about the models that were used in Wuhan to predict the epidemiologic model to predict the pandemic, the course of the pandemic. So we started a collaboration mainly with students and scholars from India at University of Michigan, and then my colleagues from Delhi School of Economics and University of Connecticut, University of Amherst, they all joined in order to contribute to this. So the models, essentially, the models that we use are SIR models, or susceptible, infected, recovered models, where you model the transmission from one compartment to another. And in terms of forecasting, you really pretend that how human behavior is going to play out on the ground. And you assume that if you have lockdown, how would the transmission probabilities from one infected individual to others are going to change. So many of you have actually heard about this R concept of the reproduction number. On an average, how many people get the disease from one infected individual. So you make assumptions about how this R is going to change. So now we have enough data to actually see whether our projections were accurate, because we projected on what would happen in July, what would happen in May. Now that we have data, we can calibrate our models and see if our models were, how accurate they were and how useful they were in guiding policy. So I would say that all the models are wrinkled with many assumptions, but the takeaway messages were quite consistent across the models in terms of the necessity for a full lockdown and then the gradual, modulated, punctuated release of the lockdown.
Right. So, Bhramar, I'm going to ask a question about a deeper question about some of the assumptions and the parameters that went into the modeling, because across the world, there have been multiple such models, and not all of them have agreed exactly on the final numbers. Now, a quick aside, and this is more to the viewers, this is for you to know that way back at the end of March, early April, Bhramar and her associates, they had predicted on the basis of their projections, as of 1st of July, India would be touching or crossing 6 lakh cases. As of 1st of July, it was just a few thousand cases short of that. As of 2nd of July, with the daily toll then of 19,148 cases, it had crossed 6 lakhs. That is how devastatingly accurate her model was. Bhramar, that cannot be crystal ball gazing. Tell me what went on there.
So I, as much as I'd like to say, take credit that the models were correct, and in this instance, I would be so happy if the models were wrong, right? So I always hope that these are the dire projections, but human beings on the ground, and government and the public cooperating together are going to beat the dire model projections, which we have seen in many places across the world that the models have been proven wrong. In our case, I think the advantage of our model was that, like academic, our typical modus operandi is that we write one paper, we do the modeling exercise, and we stop. I think our prudent choice was that not to stop and update the models daily. And I think that's why our projections have been more accurate, because we are not looking at the pandemic at a periodic basis, but we are really incorporating the ground changes every day. So our app, COVID19.org, actually produces this one table which has all the projections for India and all the states every day, daily updates. Incredible work from so many people have gone into this model. And right now we are working on comparing the various model assumptions and the projections across different models, the Imperial College model for India, the SEIR model, the SIR model. So we are. But I'd have to say that models are contingent on data. And you have to really think about the quality of data each of the countries are producing, the scale of testing, the reporting of case count and death counts. So often I feel like I'm talking about a fraction or a ratio where I know the numerator is wrong, the denominator is wrong. So, statisticians, we try to make up for this and say, oh, what if 1 out of 10 cases were reported? What if 1 out of 5 deaths were reported, to give worst and best kind of scenarios? So I would say that the daily updating has been probably why the projections have been more correct than others.
Right. Bhramar, let's talk about the lockdown specifically. Again, end of March, early April, I remember there was one interview that you gave, particularly to Times of India, where you said that epidemiological models showed that we need aggressive measures, particularly in the early phase of arresting the pandemic, and that lockdown actually buys us time. Yes. So I have a twofold question to you. A, did we buy enough time in a lockdown 1.0, 2.0, 3.0? And B, the murkier one, did we do, in your view, enough with that time?
So the analogy is that how much work do you need to do? And if you actually do that work in 1 month or 2 months, so first of all, I think lockdown was necessary, and we have seen it across natural experiments all over the world that it was important to arrest the virus and buy us time. So there is an assumption, there is an implicit assumption that the virus is going to play a Houdini and disappear after the lockdown. So this is not a Houdini virus. This virus has to be really taken seriously. So that assumption of a virus getting out of the country or the system, or the number of cases coming down to a level like New Zealand, was unreasonable. So what the lockdown was expected to do was actually really ramp up testing and healthcare infrastructure. So lockdown sounds, it's a heterogeneous, right? Many people have implemented lockdown. The implementation of the lockdown is at the core of how you are going to evaluate this non-pharmaceutical intervention. As you mentioned, with the limited time, increased mobility of the migrant workers started. So the lockdown really did not contain the disease, confine or localize the disease, but it actually led to movement and increased mobility. So you have to think about the lockdown as a word is associated with a lot of management responsibility and implementation responsibility. So we are only talking about the public health side of it. And on that front, we know that if we had instead of 8 weeks, if we had 12 weeks of lockdown, the case counts are going to go down. But is that sustainable? So you are all from economics, and it's a pleasure to talk with economists and physicists as mere statisticians producing numbers, is that you have to think about the whole goal. Because I think public health and economics have been pitted against each other in this debate, but we are all working together to minimize the loss of human lives and livelihoods and the suffering. So I feel like as policymakers, as the lockdowns are lifted, we are sort of on a Schrödinger seesaw. that we are going to maintain our position and quickly change it when the reality on the ground is changing. And we have seen that, after relaxing the lockdown, there are some cases appearing in many countries around the world, and they have to go into punctuated, modulated regional lockdowns and intervention strategies. So that's how the landscape is going to look like for a long, long time. We have to get used to this pause, restart, and drive mode of living, learning, and leading.
Did we do enough in terms of bolstering our infrastructure and bolstering public health, in bolstering just the resilience in terms of the entire ecosystem to be able to sort of deal with it over a long haul? Did we do enough, do you think?
So, there are variation. There are real variation across states. So, in terms of numbers, so when we started in the beginning of March, and then right before the lockdown started on March 25th, the reproduction number was around 3.5. And the reproduction number has come down to 1.2 and 1.3, but it has steadily plateaued around that region of 1.2, 1.3, that interval. So you need it to go below 1, and I do not know when that is going to happen looking at the trends, because the national data is sort of masking the regional trends. So I think that some states have done an incredible job in managing the pandemic and the spread. And I would really like to highlight the success in very highly congested areas like Dharavi, or what happened in Delhi in the last few days when you really ramped up testing and really buckled up. So the problem with this is that we cannot wait to see that. We have to act in advance. We have to really project and predict what are the emerging hotspots. So in terms of getting the system geared up, I think political leadership is extremely critical in managing this pandemic, and we have seen that all around the world. In order to coordinate the different sectors of the society, for example, the public health, the healthcare, the social support, and the public coming together as a collective with thoughtfully guided scientific strategies to solve, I think it's extremely critical. So, and we have seen the benefit of strong leadership and regional leaderships, which have led to remarkable progress. If you think about Dharavi, for example, the success there is it is a very low resource setting, but constant checking of temperature, symptom tracking, and particularly the centralized isolation and quarantine. This has not been emphasized enough, that it's not possible in Indian households to self-isolate. So when one person gets infected, there is cluster transmission in the neighborhood, in the household. So this creation of centralized isolation facilities pull out the infected individual from the household has really paid dividends. So simple strategies, infrastructure, discipline in wearing masks, hand hygiene, giving PPE to the healthcare workers have done. So it's just really that shows that it is doable. We can do it. So I think that it has been heterogeneous. Success has been heterogeneous, and success here is very tenuous.
When we're talking about pandemic and numbers, the narrative seems to be interspersed between peaks and hopeful plateaus. But when you're talking about peaks, let's talk about peaks for a moment. Is the concept of a national peak for a country which is as heterogeneous and as complex demographically as India, is it even tenable? Or should we actually just be looking at regional peaks or state-wise peaks?
Yes, so our second paper actually talks about this concept, that the concept of a national peak is quite nebulous. And as you can see, that there is a cascade of peaks coming through the country, and we are probably going to see this wave for the next 2 months. Mumbai and Delhi probably have stabilized. Delhi, I think, has R value below 1, actually around 0.8, 0.9 for the last 7 days, which is very encouraging. And then Mumbai has sort of slowed down, but now you have emerging hotspots in Karnataka and Telangana. So I think that that's why intercepting and anticipating these peaks as you see real-time data that you see a spread, and then you have to really go all in for curbing that surge is very, very important. And so I think that the concept of a national peak is very nebulous, because we are going to see regional peaks, and the national curve is probably not going to slow down until all the peaks subside. So if you, for a long time, India's curve looked exactly like Mumbai because that's what the largest contributor was. Now I think that we have to really look at regional strategies and regional peaks. So it's a cascade of peaks. Absolutely correct.
And many of the viewers here are of sort of original Kolkata or West Bengal provenance, or happen to be domiciled here at the moment. So when you're talking about the numbers and that sheet that you showed us earlier, what's your prognosis for West Bengal? When is it actually going to peak, and how long is that going to last?
So again, I actually, first of all, I'd really like to say that our models have been quite correct in projecting the numbers in a short time frame. For long-term projections, there is tremendous uncertainty in this model. So I always have refrained from projecting this peak time, because I think there is tremendous uncertainty depending on what happens on the ground, how people behave. Right. So, and we have seen that Delhi came up with a very dire projection, but then the projections have come down due to the actions that were taken. So for West Bengal, 1.38 is the R right now, and it has been increasing a little bit over the past few days, leading to some regional modulated lockdowns in areas of containment. The doubling time is around 20 days. So it's right at the ballpark of the national estimate. The national R is 1.26 right now. West Bengal is higher than that. Our projections in about 30 days, in about on July 30 is around 40 to 50,000 cases in West Bengal. I have to say that the case and death reports in West Bengal, I have to really encourage the government to be more mindful in terms of releasing the data with respect to not just coronavirus cases and deaths, but for potential misclassification in terms of SARI and ELI related deaths, because that's also happening quite a bit. And in order to track the pulse of the pandemic, we need a little bit more granular level of data in terms of excess cases of illnesses and excess deaths.
Also, perhaps a very good and transparent bifurcation between the comorbidities leading to death vis-a-vis, just COVID-related deaths.
Exactly.
Yes, Bhramar, we'll come back to you for more questions. I don't want our friend Bando to feel neglected. So, Bando,
I think just fine.
So, Bando, talk to us about the economic impact, the economic cost of the lockdown. And in that, compare and contrast what we've seen in India vis-a-vis what the government has done, particularly in the UK where you're based, or for that matter in the US.
Yeah, so I think, in some ways, the debate has been cast as one of saving lives versus saving the economy. I kind of think of it as deciding what kind of lives to save, right? So there's an obviously direct impact if you lock down and different sectors of the economy suffer. There's a direct economic impact, but it has an indirect health impact, because lockdown, no doubt, reduces the incidence of the disease, but it has implications for other types of diseases which get neglected. So sort of what economists call the external effect of a lockdown. So really, those again would lead to excess deaths. So deaths which would not have occurred had there not been a lockdown. So really, I think, I would cast this in terms of lives versus lives. I mean, is the lockdown saving enough lives versus the lives that we are losing because we are neglecting, early detection of cancer, because we are, neglecting things which don't seem serious. I mean, people are not going, are so afraid here that they haven't gone when they have had mild strokes, and that's led to obviously a bad prognosis for them, which could have been saved. So that's kind of how I think of it, not just the direct impact today on what we non-economists think of as the economy, but also, sort of life weighted correctly. So that's how I would think of it. And I think, all countries have had to make this decision. I mean, the UK thinks that, we brought the disease down, and the impact on deaths has been minimal. That's not true. We've had excess deaths. India is far more heterogeneous, as Bhramar pointed out, so I don't even want to make a national forecast, but and I haven't done a statistical model of India, so I can't comment, or an economic model, but it seems to me that definitely other types, anecdotally, other types of healthcare has suffered.
So, in your view, let's tackle the moot question. Are you in support of the lockdown when it happens?
Economists never give a simple yes/no answer. We always say on the one hand, on the other hand, which is why President Truman wanted a one-handed economist, because he was tired of hearing this. So I won't tell you yes or no. What I'll tell you is, here's the trade-off. If you lock down too early and the disease doesn't turn out to have consequent second and third and fourth peaks, maybe fine, you've stopped the incidence of the disease. Also, and Bhramar mentioned it in passing, you've changed behavior. So even when the lockdown eases, I'm not rushing to the pub. So that has a kind of behavioral habit formation effect. But because it's a new disease, if you lock down too early, you lose information about the prognosis and dynamics of the disease, which actually has a huge cost. So if I had to weight optimally, I would say, well, the jury is out. Because
Dave, I dare say, Bando, you might have missed a calling as a diplomat. But
maybe but seriously, I think that's what we have to do. The data is out there. I mean, I think I have to say, apart from one of the exceptions, most governments with the data available have taken a call on what they think is, shall we wait a bit longer to see how the disease progresses, what groups should we protect, and so on, versus let's lock down early and stop it. Not even lock down. And I think that everybody's looked at their parameters and taken a call in the dark, and I don't think everybody's too way off. We need to see 6 months, 2 years down the line whether Sweden's been successful, or the UK, or even India for that matter.
Right, absolutely. Let's talk about the specifics of the economy as you understand it, right? And from a sectoral point of view, we are now in an unlock mode, month and a half into that phase. Do you think that the government has put in enough stimulus and enough emphasis on the right sectors in order to stimulate growth? Is it doing the right things on the ground at the moment?
I mean, do you mean worldwide or India or UK?
Well, to begin with, maybe a worldwide projection and whatever you feel from an Indian ecosystem.
Okay, so I think worldwide governments have differed. The one thing which everybody now seems to agree is that in the short run, deficits do not matter, right? I mean, even sort of deficit, what we call deficit hawks. Some of my friends who are monitors, deficit hawks, are really worried about the deficit. They agree. Interest rates near zero. If you have to borrow, this is the right time to borrow and stimulate the economy. So the only question is the extent of it and how. I mean, do you actually try to stimulate certain sectors directly, or do you just give cash to people and let them decide how they want to spend? Now, I'm a great believer in the fact that people generally can make up their minds well. So I would prefer direct stimulus, cash to people. But there also have been sort of sectoral efforts. I think on the whole, I think all governments have been reasonably on the right track. I mean, no one's tried to do what they tried to do in the Great Depression, tried to balance the budget and something crazy when there's a need for stimulus. Whether we could do a bit more, if you ask me personally, I would do a bit more and take the risk on deficits. But I don't think most governments are not too far off. Coming to the Indian context, I would like to see a little bit more of direct stimulus, and so there are many kind of indirect measures that have been taken. And again, I have to say I'm not an expert on the precise measures taken in India, but I would like to see it go a bit further, a bit bolder. just throw money at sectors and make it grow. Don't worry about deficits now. Don't give indirect measures.
Right. Is there anything different that we should be doing that we may not have been doing, or we may not have had the opportunity to do from a public policy standpoint? Is there something new that the government should be doing here in India?
Not just in India, but I think everywhere. I think, what Bhramar mentioned about the heterogeneous effects. I don't think we can afford a second, third, fourth, fifth lockdown. I really think we need to target what are the risks. Is the risk of somebody over 70 is 10 times, or as I think it's more like 1,000 times that of a young, healthy 25-year-old, then you should start targeting your lockdowns, not lockdowns, sorry, targeting preventative measures and sort of what in the UK is called shielding, right? Because you want the rest of the people to kind of get on almost as usual. Don't think that you don't need to. I mean, I can work just as well from home, so I can, it's not that my economic output is any lower because, well, it might be slightly lower, but if I can't actually physically go to work, but otherwise, don't try a second lockdown, because it's clear now that the disease is not going to just disappear. So you need to know how to manage the disease, get more information about what are the groups that you need to protect. So how can you do some amount of social control, but at the least cost? That's what I think we need to start getting into. A blunt lockdown, I don't think we can really afford another one.
Mm-hmm. And hopefully we wouldn't have those. So Bando will be back for another round of questions. Dr. Gautama, back to you. Let's talk a little bit about the other major dimension that has played a big role in the discourse, and that is the role of government, particularly in democracies, right? Now, as you know, we've been under the Disaster Management Act, and that has given extra constitutional powers to the government at all levels, at the central level as well as the federal level, right? How responsibly do you think, on the whole, that the government has taken up this particular challenge?
As you are aware, this particular act gives sweeping powers to the central government. Having said that, the government from time to time, depending upon the situation on the ground, have been taking decisions and asking the states to implement them. And as I'm sure you must be aware, that in the act, the provisions are binding on the states. The states can make them tough, but they can't dilute those provisions. But as I did mention in my introductory remarks, this has been an unprecedented situation, and the government has also, from time to time, taken calls, which have been questioned by people, particularly relating to jobs, relating to economy, and also with regard to the impact it is going to have on the livelihood in general. So, coming back to the provisions of the Act, they are tough. The government is in a bind. What to do? Do you go for a lockdown, complete lockdown, or do you save jobs? Do you save livelihood? Do you open? And if yes, to what extent you should open? So these are the matters, which are matters of debate at times. But according to me, the government have been doing taking a call, depending upon what the prevalent situation is. Also, what the government has done is, apart from giving the broader instructions, broader guidelines, they have left to the states. And as I did mention, the Act provides that the states can make it tough, but they cannot dilute these provisions. Having said that, as one of my co-panelists mentioned, the different states have viewed this position from different angles, depending upon their experiences. Some of them, as we see in the hindsight, have done a good job. Some of them, as we say, have not done a good job, saying thereby they could have done better. They would have done this, they could have done this. Say, for example, I will give you a small example of banning the international flights. There is a view that if it was done 10 days ahead of what it was done, perhaps it could have saved a lot of the problems that we are having right now. So, coming back to the fundamental question that you have raised, the Act gives enormous powers to the center, but within those powers, there is a very tough call for the government, any government, to see to what extent they should do. And as I was mentioning, the bulk of the responsibility lies with the state governments, because that is where the implementation lies, and also the people, and to what extent we are taking them on board.
Right. So extending the powers to the federal structure, as you know, and this is more than a month back, that it started with the UP and then it was followed, adopted by quite a few of the other states, the change in the labor law. I mean, it is fair to say that all sectors across the board have been pretty badly impacted, and some obviously more than others. But if you have the institution of a new law which overrides everything in terms of labor laws and unionizations and rights of labor at different grades and categories, to say that, okay, for the next 3 years, everything is held in abeyance. So you can hire, and more importantly in this case, fire at will. Now, that creates a huge amount of turmoil from a sociological standpoint, right? Dr. Gautama, what's your feeling on that?
Absolutely. You see, as you would know, that these labor laws have been a bit of a bone of contention, and for a very good reason. Because you see, if the power is there to hire and fire people at will, which perhaps at times required, then it has other dimensions. So what most of the governments do is, depending upon the situation, depending upon the circumstances, they do take a law, they do take a call and make laws which are relevant at that particular point in time. Now, these laws cannot be, for example, if you look at I'll give an analogy of the SCZs. In SCZs, as you would have known, that the labor laws are much more tough than in the other industrial sector. The reason is because it is linked up with your services to the people which are outside your country, and that has to be uninterrupted in nature. And in a democratic setup that we have, at times, it is perhaps not desirable, or it is not necessary, because a large number of people are in an area where they do not have sources of livelihood. Having said that, I would like to mention there is no compromise on the productivity. There is no compromise on the efficiency. Now, if on grounds of productivity and if on grounds of efficiency, meaning thereby the KPIs or some standard benchmarks, some weeding out is done, that is absolutely fine. But if these powers are used arbitrarily because you do not have cash or you do not have enough money in the system, then perhaps it is harsh to those people. And that is where the question comes. And that is why I was mentioning that this is a situation which is very, very unprecedented and tough for everyone.
Absolutely. Bhramar, as you know, right, again, and this happens more in popular media than anywhere else, where everybody talks about free press and the freedom of expression and of protest, and that is supposed to be one of the hallmarks of a thriving democracy. But in this particular instance, my sense is it's not a curb of powers, but the spirit of collaboration between governments on the one hand, and let's say medical practitioners, on analysts, researchers, and experts on the other hand, is extremely important. And one of the checks on not just the totalitarian extent of a government's power, but also their policy, is the level of collaboration or the level of dependence that they have on the council of the experts, right? So in your view and in your experience, have governments across the world, and again, then you can talk about India in particular, taken enough heed about projections, about prognosis, about suggestions coming in from experts such as yourself, and have they been doing enough?
So I think you asked me this question in the United States. So so I'm sitting here, and I think that there is a testament that not all scientific advices were taken into account into policy decisions. So again, there is tremendous heterogeneity. For example, I'm in Michigan. The Michigan governor actually formed a team of interdisciplinary scientists from different universities in Michigan. Many of my colleagues participated with their models, with their projections. And one thing Bando mentioned, which is extremely important, is actually risk stratification. That in order to open up the economy, if you could risk stratify that who is at the highest risk and protect the vulnerable. So the distribution of loss and the distribution of death has not been equal. If you think about public health, it has not been equal. If you think about economics, it has not been equal. So I think that, and then I also have to say that scientists have to really proceed with humility, because we have seen there are so many unknowns. There is only limited amount of things that we certainly know about this virus, and the guidelines and the guidance keep changing. And I think it is important for the public and the government and the scientists to work together. And I'd just like to say, for example, we see different performances in the governments and in the region. So Kerala and Punjab. So these are the two states I have been watching from the very beginning, have done a very good job in terms of controlling the pandemic. And if there is a second peak, really arresting that second peak, because as mobility changes, it's inevitable that you are going to have some resurgence of cases. The hope is that they are in a manageable number so that you can contact trace and isolate and take proper care of those cases. It does not overwhelm the system. So I think Kerala and Punjab strategies are, though, quite different. If you think about Kerala, the historic tenets of literacy, medical care, and we have all read incredible accomplishment by Dr. Shailaja. So, and then if you look at Punjab's strategy was very data-driven. They really actually collected data at a granular level and did a lot of contact tracing and isolation. So none of them were relying on testing, right? Because the testing capacities were limited. Whereas when we came to arresting the pandemic in South Korea or Iceland, testing was their strategy. So there is very heterogeneous strategies across the world. And one thing I'd like to mention about Sweden. So Sweden is an interesting case study for the whole world. And they did not do lockdown. And Bando said that, I actually totally disagree with Bando about that, the timing of the lockdown, that you should wait and see the progression of the pandemic, and there is an optimal timing and you want to track the transmission. I disagree with that, and there are reasons for that. But Sweden never did a lockdown. So did they protect themselves from the economic loss, but not by not doing lockdown? So recent data shows that the shrinkage in Sweden's economy has been very comparable to Norway and Denmark, other Scandinavian countries, 4.5% shrinkage and 25% reduction in people spending compared to 29% in Norway. So it is not true that the lockdown is just killing the economy. It's the psychology of the people, it's the virus which is actually really killing the economy. So as long as we do not find a solution or curb the number of virus cases, the economy is not going to swing back up. So I really want to say this because Sweden is a very interesting case study, and the number of deaths per million has been far greater, and the economic losses have not been substantially lower. So how do we justify and put that into a big cost-benefit model? I'd also like to say that the delay in care and other diseases is very important. But the number of accidents, the number of infectious diseases, diarrhea, gastrointestinal diseases, these have all gone down. So we really need an omni model which actually incorporates the lives saved and the lives lost in this time period. And it will take a lot of work and a lot of data in order to come up with that, which can feed into a big policy model. So I think the success is very heterogeneous, and strategies have to be very context and region dependent.
Speaking of strategies, Bhramar, unlike Sweden, where this particular problem has been extant for a very long time and it's always been highlighted, and indeed elsewhere in the West, there is a cost to the human psyche. There is the emotional and psychological trauma, which I think is completely understated and understood and misunderstood, the scale and the level of it from an Indian context, right? What do you think that the public healthcare system and the government in general should be doing to take care of that? Because as you said, right, we're not automatons like a flip on, flip off, like a switch on, switch off, on, off, right? There are tremendous sort of inner processes that that struggle to come up with that kind of a scenario, like a lockdown to an unlock, and therefore, right?
So I think that's a great question. And I think we are focusing, and the media has chosen to focus on COVID-19 cases and COVID-19 deaths. But what about the emotional and social cost of this? And I think that there is almost no quantification of what is going on in each individual household level, workplace level, how hard it has been we have heard stories about domestic violences going up, mental health related illnesses, suicides. So I think that this is the time where, of course, we need trust in the government, in trust in the science and the data that are being released. We need a sense of empathy as much as efficiency. I think that's very, very important, that we have not talked about in this discussion, that the loss of lives and the loss of and the suffering has not been uniform across all strata in the society. The distribution of loss is very unequal. So how to protect the most vulnerable? So to think about the empathy factor, but also I think societies really need to come together here. I think we all have to support each other, that it is physical distancing, not social distancing, and reach out to all of those people that are in our circle, protect all the daily wage earners in our circle so that they feel supported. And I think we cannot just put the responsibility of this all creating this social support as safety net on the government. I think everybody has to work together and partner in their daily lives, and then the ripple effect of their various organization, organized sector, NGO structure, but we cannot really undermine what is happening to human lives and human mind during this time, and that should be much more in media attention.
A sidebar question to you, and I'll ask the same question to Bando as well a minute later. There have been a couple of questions around education, right? And the fact that a lockdown or a near lockdown scenario has shifted the entire mode of education from an in-person interaction between the professors and the students to one of online, right? So, and it looks as if, that's going to be the norm for quite some time to come. What have been some of the challenges that you have faced in your own experience? And give me some pros and cons of an online mode of education.
So are you asking me to talk first or Bando?
You first, and then we'll go to Bando.
Okay. So for us, I think then again, it is a very class differentiated conversation. I'd like to really decouple into two parts. People, and the people who are on one side of the digital divide and the other. So people who are have good bandwidth, internet access, and in premier institutes of education, their challenges are quite different from people who come to school for their meals. People who are just sitting at home without any education because they don't have an internet, their parents do not have smartphones or any kind of like internet connection. So we really are ignoring education for the low socioeconomic status sector in this conversation. That's a huge problem. I think I see this in the United States. We are not talking about particular social strata. I think if you talk about the institutes of premier education and universities, I think online education, there is a lot of creative innovations being done. And I think it is now that we know that indoor spaces with lots of people for a sustained period of time are really the high-risk environment. So we have to really think about creative strategies in terms of bringing students back. And we have to think about, high school, K through 12, and then undergraduate and the graduate education. And it has different challenges. I have to say that in terms of bringing kids back to school, there have been very creative approaches in Europe. So I was watching a documentary where kids were like, they are using the local churches, which are not used during the week, in order to take kids in a larger space. So that 50 kids in a big church auditorium, and
the congregation is not happening.
Yes,
so there's still social distancing, but at the same time you have interaction, you have that human connect.
Exactly. And the math teacher is on the pulpit talking about math. They're doing their statistics outside in the work. They're actually going to the cemeteries and looking at tombstones to learn about numbers. So because outsides are more safe to get together as a classroom. So I think that several creative solutions and context-dependent solutions can be done. I think in rural areas in good weather, it is possible to hold classrooms socially distanced in big fields or terraces. So we have to think about these strategies and also connecting with our students. Online education is a very different modality. It's very easy to turn off your video and play with your cat. So you have to really put something engaging and have the students participate and do something active. So active learning is coming back big time. In Michigan, we think the face-to-face interaction is very important. So we are thinking about alternating attendance strategies, that some students come to class and we put the class in big rooms. And then we have a randomized schedule of who gets to come to class, and the overflow watches the classes online. So this is a really big challenge. And I do think that we have to think about all socioeconomic sectors who have access to high bandwidth and Zoom and BlueJeans, and those who don't, and those who depend on the school for emotional sustenance, for meals, for social support, children from families, broken homes, who are coming to their teachers for their only resource in terms of intellectual as well as emotional sustenance. We have psychological sustenance. We really have to think how to bring kids back gradually with some face-to-face interaction, but mostly online and virtual.
Right. Bando, your views on online, the new normal mode of learning?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'm in this case, I pretty much agree. This is experts' digital divide. But I'd like to take this question to sort of illustrate the point I meant about the economy. So the economy is not about whether Sweden's economy has shrunk by the same GDP amount as Norway. The point about the economic losses are that a lockdown, by differentially impacting people, so the rich kids, they're probably fine with online education and so on and so forth. The poor kids are not, and if education is the way out of your poverty trap, then that's a long-term cost of lockdown, which is unaccounted for. So I think we need to be really, really careful when we say, oh yes, see, Sweden did not lock down and ultimately the economy has shrunk. How do we know what the long-term costs are? How do we know what the human costs are of not imposing a lockdown? And actually, how do we know what the cost will be if a second pandemic comes, because they may have learned a bit more about the disease? So I think we need to be careful when about sort of saying, oh yes, Sweden is a disaster. I mean, actually, if you look at the newspapers, for every article which says Sweden is a disaster, there's another which says, actually, come winter, we might be looking at Sweden for some ideas about how to stop, because they know more about the dynamics of the disease. So yeah, I'm trying to answer two questions. One is that the costs to the economy are not exactly just the costs of short-term GDP, but second, the digital divide in education is a good example of the long-term costs of lockdown and of increasing inequality in society, which models don't take into account.
Yeah, I get where you're coming from. Bando, talk to us about some of the sectors. And I know you're not a macroeconomic specialist when India is concerned, but still, we know that across the board, if you're talking about travel, tourism, hospitality, and all of the associate sectors, allied sectors, have taken massively bad hit, right? Yeah. Do you think that at the moment the government is doing enough in terms of relaxing, in terms of the travel restrictions, and also in terms of the stimulus that it's given to them?
There are two things. Obviously, in terms of the travel restriction, I think that is a decision in which the dynamics of the disease propagation probably rightly plays a most important role. But second, even if you do, people have to want to travel. I mean, just because I can, I'm not taking the next train to London. So the hospitality sector is in for a very tough time in the medium run, unless a vaccine comes in the next 3 to 6 months. And obviously, I don't think any of us are experts here to be able to predict whether it will or not. It's not clear that some of the industries or hotels or so on are going to survive. So, what's the solution? I mean, do we try to keep it going in the hope, as in, with the stimulus and with subsidies, as parts of the UK have done, and keep a sector going which may pick up if we are lucky and we get a vaccine or so some kind of a treatment repurposed or otherwise in a year? I would try, but I think one has to seriously think of, do we need therefore a restructuring and retraining? Do some people need to be retrained because some sectors have contracted? So I think that's going to be the next question for all governments to ask. If there is a change in the sectoral composition of the economy, how do we make sure that demand meets supply across this new sectoral composition? How do you give them the adequate training? You haven't done it yet, but I think we need to start doing that.
Right. And I think this brings up a larger point as well, Bando, when you're talking about not just the processes, but also the technology and the technique of production. I'm talking more in terms of manufacturing, plants and assembly line, etc., where you have tremendous amount of social congregation in a business as usual, non-pandemic scenario. Now, as you know, over the last few years, over the last decade or so, there has been an increasing sort of trend in terms of process automation and the use of technology, the use of IoT and some modicum of machine learning when it comes to manufacturing, when it comes to processes. Now, in an overpopulated, highly densely populated economy such as India, one thing, one option, right? One technologically and health-wise feasible option would be for many companies to adopt for a more capital intensive, technological intensive mode of production, as opposed to the erstwhile labor intensive mode of production. And that means that more and more people are going to continue to lose their jobs, even as the economy surfaces maybe 6 months down the line or a year down the line to pre-COVID levels. What's your view on that?
So this is what Schumpeter calls creative destruction. I mean, the COVID virus accelerates what was inevitable, that there would be a move towards some kind of mechanization, and we lose old jobs and new jobs are created, say in the knowledge sector, in the service sector, and so on. So India was probably going through a transition anyway, in some ways. It still managed to keep certain labor intensive industries which were not really effective or wouldn't have been effective in other countries. So it's just facing this Schumpeterian destruction a bit earlier, which brings me back to my last point. You need to start preparing for what is going to be the economy of the future and start training people for that, start giving incentives for people to move to those sectors. We don't really need assembly line working anymore. Start creating and incentivizing those sectors which are going to be the future of the world economy. The pandemic has sort of, I think, accelerated our thinking, or should accelerate our thinking around that.
Mm-hmm. Any specific views around public healthcare policies?
We have invested too little in public health all over the world, just because we've been a bit lucky, that SARS died out and a couple of other things died out.
Ebola, etc. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, Ebola, I have to say there was some good management as well. So there was something there. So I think we've invested too little. I mean, governments all over the world have a tendency to spend on things which show immediate returns, to show their population, see, we built this, we built that, we've done this. Something like prevention, preparing for the next pandemic, there's been too little. And I think if one was to do a cost-benefit analysis, we've badly lagged. And by we, I mean the whole world. Mm-hmm. I hope this will be an impetus for all governments to start thinking and, that we need more investment in public health. We need to cooperate. Whether the WHO has been a bit flawed is not the point. We need to make it better. We don't need to, and I'm being slightly political, we don't need to start defunding the WHO now.
Right. Bhramar, do you have a rejoinder there?
So I think that this is music to my ears, that you should invest more in public health, being in a school of public health. So finally, I give Bando my blessing and approval. So I think that this is extremely important to invest in prevention, because we get disease, we get treatment. That has been our mentality. It is true that in order to maintain the pandemic response team that the United States had, for 10 years, it would have cost probably $1 billion. And look at the $1 trillion that you're paying now. So I think that in order to being prepared is extremely important. You just cannot count on rare probability events to happen. And I think that India's investment in public health, and I would particularly like to emphasize health-related data and health-related data science, need to escalate. And this is a good time for the government to reflect and invest in those opportunities.
Absolutely. We are coming up very close to stoppage time. So, Dr. Gautama, we began the session with you, and we would like to end the session as well with your comments. Okay. All right. Maybe we'll wait for a minute for him to come back. He might have just got disconnected. No, he's coming back. We'll give it a minute. Dr. Gautama, can you hear me? Yeah. So
I can hear you now.
I was saying we began the session with you, so it'll be great for you to sort of draw full circle to our program and conclude with your comments and also your views on the way forward.
Okay, as we have discussed, during the last 1 hour, it is difficult and it's a tough call for everyone. But having said that, as my co-panelist had mentioned, that a level of preparedness is always good. It is always desirable. One does learn from experience, but we do have a lot of experience in sort of handling various kind of disasters. So in a situation like this, I would also like to mention, particularly for a country like India, our problems also are very diversified in nature. The complexity of the demography, complexity of the sectors across, and complexity of the understanding, reaching it to the people, wherein we all have a very, very important role to play, not as a government, but also as a civil society. So having said that, I would also like to mention that in a situation like this, it is important that we all are on the same page, be it the government, be it the civil society, and be the media, and be the public at large, and be the policy makers. So I'm sure that with these kind of situation that is in front of us, we would definitely be taking forward to the next level, which would be much better than what it is today.
Lovely. This has been an absolutely engrossing conversation, and I'm sure the viewers, like myself, have lots of takeaways and have learned as during the course of this conversation. Dr. G.D. Gautama, Bhramar Mukherjee, Siddartha, Bandopadhyay, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to all of you. Viewers, I hope you enjoyed this session, and we'll be back again next week with a new episode of Candid Talk. Till then, thank you, stay safe, and goodbye.
Thanks, Avik.
Thank you. Thank you so much.